Boardroom Bound, Episode 72, What Commonalities Exist Among All Boards, with Coco Brown.
We are seeing boards simply saying we need broader capabilities around these 3 to 5 key imperatives that we know are going to be what creates our viability or over the next, X years.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Coco Brown. She is the founder and CEO of the Athena Alliance, which is a fabulous digital ecosystem and platform designed to build a community, learning, and access for top women in business to land into the boardroom. Coco has phenomenal stories that just translate so simply what we all need to do to move over into the business world. And I think my favorite lines from today are about how you think about applying to the boardroom as you would applying to college. I've never heard someone explain it on these levels. It's something we can easily digest and then implement ourselves. I want to share this episode with you today, so let's jump on into it. Coco Brown, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, delighted to have you on the show today and excited for our audience to hear about the fascinating and fabulous work that you're doing over with the Athena Alliance. But just as a bit of a scene setting for everybody, because when we have our guests on here, I like to explain it. You don't get to become a board member overnight. It took years of experience and networking and knowledge and everything like that. Can you walk us a bit through your career history and trajectory to where you got to the point today where you realized this is something I can be helping other people with?
Yes, absolutely. I have been an executive and in an executive role since I was 27 years old. And this year I will be 50, so you can do the math. And so it's been quite a number of years that I have been operating in a VP level and above. I have always been, or let's say 80% of my career has been focused in tech companies and with a large professional services component to them. I ran for 10 years a company called Taos, which is in the IT professional and managed services space. So from 2002 to 2012, I was the president and COO of that company, grew it significantly, including diversifying the business into a managed services offering based in Boise, Idaho. And I was one of 3 owners of that company. And naturally, as a result of both my role and my ownership, was on the board of that company. So that was my first boardroom experience, was just by nature of the fact that I was in, that sort of founder-operator role that often results in, or most of the time results in somebody being on the board of a company. So I spent 12 years on the board. I stepped down from running the company in 2012, stayed on the board for 2 years, during which time we did a lot to restructure compensation, and I also then negotiated my sale of my ownership to the other 2 founders, and moved on. So learned a lot about transitioning from being a employee owner board member to being just an owner board member to then also negotiating out of a company entirely. So that was quite an experience. I was with House for 17 years, and the first 7 or so of those in various different management roles, kind of climbing the ladder. So that's my background story. That's how I got to, that's what happened right before Athena and starting Athena, which I did in 2016.
And so was it fair to say, you talked about not really experiencing the boardroom before that. Did that begin to change your view of, wow, this might be a career? I might be able to do professional board work. How did perhaps that thought process happen for you versus thinking, Athena is this niche and I can help and be useful to other people and expand out my opportunity set and my awareness for them as they grow and develop?
Yeah, it's really interesting because during those 10 years, 12 years that I was on the board, for the first 10 of those where I was also running the company, I never really thought of the board as being this separate entity because, it was a 3-person board of the 3 owners of the company. We were fully self-funded. We never took any external funding that would bring in outside board members. So there were a lot of ways in which it was a fluid extension of my day job, if you will, and I didn't really think about it in a standalone context until I stepped down from running the company and now was an outside board member, if you will. I was still, one of the owners of the company, but I had this external role now. And that was the first time I really started thinking about the board as its own complete separate entity, interestingly enough, from my own perspective. However, the real eye-opener for me around board service as a career and board service as a higher echelon kind of reach for leaders who want to do more than, reach the C-suite, who want to go beyond the C-suite. I started really thinking about that when I was invited to a roundtable discussion with Senator Mark Warner, who was in Silicon Valley visiting from Virginia, getting into the hearts and minds of Silicon Valley. And one of the sessions he had was a discussion with female leaders in the area, and there were about 20 of us that were invited to this conversation with the senator. And he asked us, what's on your mind? And we immediately went to the boardroom. And it was stunning to me to see these women who had held and were holding very big, significant roles in well-known companies who were frustrated at the lack of the visibility to them and consideration of them for board seats. And I got a flurry of emails the next day saying, hey, Coco, you've been trying to figure out what to do next and solve this problem. and and the directive came to me specifically because back in 2004, when I, 2 years into me now fully running house, I had my own version of imposter syndrome where, I was questioning myself, thinking, gosh, I was a psychology major. I've never touched a line of code in my life, and here I am running a deeply technical company. And it's one thing to do a turnaround, which is what I was brought in to do at that time from the dot-com bust, and to keep us out of bankruptcy. But now I'm running a real going concern again, and I'm rebuilding this thing. And do I really deserve to be at the helm here? And then also looking around at all of my customers and also our consultants, almost all of whom were men. So I had all these reasons to doubt myself. And so I had started a dinner group with female CIOs, Chief Information Officers, because I would meet one and she'd say, well, I'm the only one in the Valley. And so I started saying, you're not. And these dinner groups that I started were a way for me to connect with my customer base and to gain knowledge about their world and get more comfortable with my own and my own place in that world. And it became this great community for me that I built up. And by the time I left house, it was 150-some very senior women, VP level and above in IT. And then we expanded into any C-suite function, and I kept these going, and the women would rotate the expense between them. And that foundation is what had these women, after the senator left our discussion, saying, hey, Coco, you've got this really great foundation of fantastic women, and you can solve this boardroom
And that was about 4 years ago, right? And is it the easiest way for our audience to conceptualize it? It's a digital platform for connectivity. How would you describe it?
Yes, yes. There is a ongoing, persistent experience of Athena, which is a digital platform that is a combination of community engagement plus learning plus access to opportunity. And then there's add-ons on top of that where most of our communities are also have a specific goal in mind, like Board Seeker, and they have an accelerator that includes 8 hours of one-on-one direct coaching with top-tier coaches, plus we build their brand package, their bio, their CV, their LinkedIn. And so that's an add-on experience that also happens virtually through video, through phone, through email. So the entire Athena experience is virtual. And the platform, in terms of the community element of it, think of it as a walled garden around a LinkedIn. Every woman can find every other woman. We connect them across geographies and industries and roles to help activate opportunity for each other and learning for each other. A third of our members, by way of example, are on significant boards, from Coca-Cola to Sally Mae to PNC and everything in between, Box and on and on. And they act as mentors within this community. They trade, the women who have already significant board experience trade their time for access to the platform. So there's this great community component to what we do. The second big component of what we do within the platform is learning. We do something we call virtual salons, where we gather women in a virtual living room, if you will, through video conference, and we discuss deep insights into the boardroom and anything from how do you understand the cap table of a private company to what happens when the CEO suddenly disappears. And then the third component is that every board opportunity that comes to us comes to our members. We post the opportunities on our internal platform and show the women their likely percent match to those. And then they can, regardless of their match, they can say, look, I look like a 33% match to this opportunity, but I'm exactly what they should be looking for, and here's why. So it's the one system out there that puts trends and opportunity right in front of women so that they have a chance to weigh in, as opposed to waiting to be found and hoping that people will think of them the right way.
Now, I love that idea you talked about there about the percentage match. And this is, let's expand on this for our audience, because imagine that you get chosen for the final board candidate slate and you're going forward. Maybe there's 5 or 6 people in total. Generally, they're 100% on spec, right? They're the standouts. They're going to get picked. They're going forward because these are such competitive roles. If you're looking, say, at large public companies we were talking about before. How does that work for some of your members who are saying, I may not be the perfect fit. I think I should be. They should be looking at me. How do you help them bridge that gap?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand that the further we go in our careers, the more complicated we become, and the harder it is to narrow us down to keyword searches. For example, I'll give you a great example. There is a very senior leader, corporate vice president at Microsoft, who has an obscure title. But if you took her role, that is just, 1 or 2 removed from Satya himself, and you expressed it within the context of even a mid-cap company, she would be a chief operating officer. But she's not discoverable that way because it's not the title, and she's in this behemoth company, and you have to know more about specifically what she does and where she sits in the organization and how it relates to the overall strategy, et cetera, in order to get to the equivalent of her up against, a COO of any sort of mid-sized company, let's say. So it's really hard for her to be found. She's also not an officer of the company. So so if you look at just sort of the pure spec kinds of things, boards will say, well, we want somebody who's an officer of the company. We want somebody who, has a C-level title, et cetera, and these things would sort of put her out of running. So she may look like a 33% match to something that she's a perfect match for. Now, she just joined through Athena, a $15 billion market cap public company. That she would not have had exposure to her and vice versa if it weren't for the way that we expose opportunities to our members so that they can raise their hand properly and say, hey, here's how you position me for this. And so that's super important. And the reason it's also so important is because if you look at the whole, there's the very visible companies will have executive search engaged with them. The companies that are about to go public or that are large publics. But usually those executive search firms are managing a process, and the board itself is still sourcing from their network. And they're casting a wide net. The recruiters are helping them do that. But they're bringing in candidates from their own network as well. And those candidates from their own networks are not meeting a spec and ultimately are the ones who are chosen. And that's just for where there are recruiters involved. Most of the time there is no recruiter involved. And so most people who join boards don't end up meeting 5 out of 5 on a spec. They end up meeting maybe 3, and then because they're well known, the board comes up with other reasons for why that person should fit. And so we're just giving women the opportunity to do the same thing by putting the opportunity in front of them and letting them shape the narrative to say, here's how to position me, here's how I fit.
And that skill set, being able to figure out how you, in a sense, I will say, market yourself is true whether you're male or female or part of the majority or the minority, whatever your position is, that is an essential part to it. And I imagine you are right in the epicenter of some shifts happening right now. So you are out in California. You've been there a long time. California very recently passed this very public legislation, which I think is really just sort of solidifying some trends that we've been seeing happening over a long time. So I'm very proud to be part of the steering committee for 2020 Women on Boards. There's a lot of good movement to make some change happen. How are you seeing that on the ground where you are?
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple of really interesting trends. One is that not related to gender or underrepresentation, but related to how different these last 10 years have made the world. We are seeing boards having to have a broader set of capabilities around the table than they ever did in the past. And so one thing I'm seeing is boards not simply saying the right profile for a board member is a CEO, seated or former CEO or financial expert or CFO. They're no longer saying that, like off the bat. They're instead saying we need broader capabilities around these 3 to 5 key imperatives that we know are going to be what creates our viability or our competitive differentiation or our scaling for over the next, X years. This is what's going to get us to the next point in our horizon. And so those 3 to 5 imperatives may be expressed as a pivot in the business model, an expansion globally, a doubling down on a particular vertical, a rebranding of the business, these sorts of things. And so then they start to look for personas and backgrounds and capabilities that are broader, that might come from a chief marketing officer or a chief product officer or chief technology officer or chief information officer. That is probably the biggest, most exciting thing for women, because women are only 6% of CEOs and 11% of CFOs, but they are 32% of chief marketing officers, 35% of chief customer officers, 55% of CHROs. So one of the biggest things I'm seeing that has nothing to do directly, it wasn't driven by a gender issue, is that broadening the capabilities that we're looking for in the boardroom has opened up the possibilities for women tremendously. That's one big thing. The other big thing I'm seeing is that the ruling, this law made the boardroom almost a household topic. So my friends and neighbors now know that this is important, where it really was a very quiet thing that, people who care about it a lot know were hearing about it all the time, but most people weren't thinking about top leadership and boardrooms and where the dynamics were. But now they are. And so what I'm seeing there is that younger companies, the venture-backed companies, the smaller companies, are getting a lot of internal pressure from their employees and their customers asking, what's the makeup of your board? So we're seeing more and more private companies interested in making sure they have a good structure, the right board design, and good diverse balance on their board.
I would add there's another really interesting trend to that I'm seeing, where you're getting a big change from 20, 30 years ago. It was very common to have someone who's on a board to be on 4, potentially 5 other boards as well. Very, very rare today, especially, first of all, there's a couple things. You're just so busy if you're a sitting officer. You don't have, nor does your board have appetite for you to do too much other outside of work. So there's this growing awareness that we are absolutely fine having someone who's never been in a boardroom before, assuming you can give the representative skill set, maybe presented to boards, worked with boards, you've been in the C-suite and done that sort of stuff. And that's also beginning to change the game. I imagine you're probably seeing that for your members as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, another thing that's happened in the last several years is that the general public is holding companies more accountable to their behavior, to, the way they engage with the broader world. And so a lot of these sort of philosophical and esoteric and sort of real questions of longevity and strategy are being pushed to the board level, that requires boards to engage in a lot more than we had expected of them in the past. In the past, it was sort of a role to retire to, and you showed up at the quarterly meetings and you read the materials on the plane on the way out, and you paid attention, but it was really about sort of compliance and backward looking and making sure that things were on the up and up, and then thinking about succession of the CEO and the board itself. And now boards are really being pressured to understand the bench strength of the organization, engage with shareholders and stakeholders, have positions on culture and purpose, and be engaged in stewarding those items, and thinking deeply about digital transformation and risk. And so that means that the job is much bigger. And that means, really, and they're looking for contemporary experience. So if you're a seated operator, meaning you have a day job, how many boards can you actually sit on in addition to that? I would argue at most one public and one private. And that's it for your, if you've got an operating role as well.
I mean, it is exciting times. You were talking about it before, that your friends and neighbors have a sense of the boardroom's important thing and what it should mean no matter what they do for a living. And we're seeing that. Unfortunately, there's all sorts of scandals. We could name easily tons and tons of them between Uber and Viacom and all that sort of stuff. There's no question these are important situations. And there are a lot of people listening to the show are going, exactly, that's what I want to do. I want to be in there. I want to be helpful. I want to change things. Some of who are ready today. The examples you give of people who are the equivalent or already in the C-suite and are ready to go, just working on their positioning. Others who are preparing for it, right? They're about to be the next role in the C-suite and moving on from there. How do you guide people sort of in those beginning steps who are preparing for it to say, here's the most important thing you should do? I don't know, do you advise them focus on your network and building that out before you're ready? What's the advice that you give?
I the advice I give is, first of all, you have to be at a place where you have enough broad wisdom and experience as an executive. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in the C-suite, but as an executive, to be able to translate your great career as a line leader into a story of you as an overarching steward of business. So, for example, if you grew up through product or marketing, if you can't speak to your relevance as a leader across the whole organization, then you are not multidimensional enough, at least in the way that you think and present yourself, to really add tremendous value around a table that is a collective that looks over the whole business. So I think the first thing is make sure you're at a point where you can look back over your own history and see the themes that you can articulate around scale, impact in various different economic cycles, diversification of the business, things that are broad and big and touch beyond a functional line. So I would say, that would be sort of one way of kind of gauging your own personal readiness. And the second thing I would say is think about it the way we would guide our children to apply to college. Our children go
and not in the way of the recent scandals. You mean in the right way to do it?
In the right way to do it. That our children go through all the way up through high school in this very linear progression. They get through grade school, they go to middle school, they go through high school, they go from one grade to another, they take a series of classes, they may take 5 AP classes, and they might get the right GPA, and they might do the community service that they're supposed to do. But they think of all of these things as these discrete things and a linear path. And they think of it as, how far in math and which kinds of math did I take? As soon as they're applying to college, though, they have to think about themselves completely holistically. And it's the first time they've ever done it, really, for a lot of them. And it's not dissimilar if we think about ourselves as adults going through our career and then wanting to step into that boardroom. Or even the C-suite, because the C-suite is similar. It's a totally different atmosphere in the way you have to look at your role across the whole organization and the time scale of your role. So, for example, with colleges are looking at kids for their potential, their passion, and their character. And kids need to be thinking about colleges in terms of their safety, their match, and their reach. So I say the same thing to anybody looking to join a board. What would be your safety, your match, and your reach? Like, start building some examples of these. And the way that you figure that out is, how much scale have you ever run, led, seen, been a part of? That's kind of like your GPA, if you will, right? If I've only ever built or been a part of a company at max $50 million in revenue, that kind of sets a little bit of my frame for where I would be a good fit. Because most companies are looking for people to join the board who can lead them to the next level of scale that they're trying to get to, not who've been at a smaller scale or have only gotten to the scale where they currently are. Now that's a gross generalization. It's not always the truth, but it's a good way of sort of looking at a baseline for what my safety match and reach might be. But if my goal is really that reach, then I have to think about, like, what do I bring to the table here that would overcome the shortfallings that I have, right? In the same way that you would do with a college application, again. So, and I also say, don't be afraid of the fact that you may have to go with your safety or your match and build up to your reach. transfer or go to grad school. But that's okay. It's not, I want to join a board, and so therefore I want to join a public board, and that's the only option. And if you really want to get into board service as a part of a career path over time, you have to think about it as maybe having some stepping stones and building up to those bigger boards.
Coco, I love that analogy, and I think the equivalent that I would use in a very simplistic way is baseball. You usually don't go straight to the majors. Usually you've gone through the minor leagues and you worked your way up from the other level, single A to double A to triple A before you get up to the majors. You're not going to join Coca-Cola's board usually on your first board opportunity. So I think that makes so sense. I love the way you've described that. I may have to borrow that. Very good. I'm amazed how much we've covered today in our short period of time. Clearly, lots of great work that you're doing with the Athena Alliance, wonderful value you're adding to the organization. I love the way you've described some of the things, such as the percentage match, which really gives someone a good sense very quickly about the opportunities. And we were just so excited to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. And if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will see links to everything we've talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be boardroom bound.